And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and every month we visit a different university to talk to professors who are also authors about their books. Now joining us on Book TV is Thomas Banchoff, and he is the author of this book, Embryo Politics. Professor Banchoff, what do you mean by embryo politics?
Well, embryo politics refers to politics centered on a critical ethical question or set of questions about when human life begins and deserves protection, about when embryos might be sacrificed in scientific experiments to advance biomedical knowledge. It's something we're familiar with in this country, of course, in the context of the stem cell debates of the last decade, those passionate debates. What I do in the book is go back 4 decades to the beginning of this controversy, show how it's developed to the point it's reached today, but also place it in broader international context through an examination of France, the UK, and Germany as well.
Why did you choose those? And the subtitle also refers to Atlantic Democracies, but why did you choose those nations?
Well, several reasons. One is that I'm a Europeanist by training. I'm a political scientist, and I've lived in Europe 6 or 7 years. So I know these countries, I know the languages, I know the culture, and it's important to be able to immerse yourself in a different culture in crafting a book like this. But I think the main reason has to do with the fact that these are leading scientific powers that have been on the cutting edge of the science, the technology, as well as the ethical debates around these issues. And it's in these countries that you've seen the political systems take up these questions in the most systematic fashion.
When did the history of embryo politics begin?
Well, I date it from 1968, a year, of course, that is familiar to us as one of great social unrest. But I suspect historians looking back will note it for another reason. That's the first time in human history that a human egg and sperm were united in the laboratory in 1968 in Cambridge, England. And it's the beginning of a story that began around questions of IVF, in vitro fertilization, a story that led to the birth of the first child by IVF, or test tube baby, in 1978, that runs up through embryonic stem cell research, that initial breakthrough in 1998, and right up to today.
Who's the father and or mother of embryo politics? Who began this experiment that led to 1968?
Well, there's a team of Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe, based in the UK, who were first successful in the creation of an embryo in the laboratory and began first efforts to transfer it to the womb. But it was an international race that had been going on for some time, including researchers from different countries. The politics of it really only picked up after it came to wider public notice. Ethics committees and so on had looked into it in the 1970s. There were debates within bureaucracies on both sides of the Atlantic. But I think seeing that first child through IVF in 1978, Louise Brown, really, which we all remember, those of us who are old enough, really brought this issue to the attention of a wider public.
That 1978 birth of Louise Brown, does that compare to the founding of a vaccine for polio, et cetera, as far as scientific experiments?
I think so. Absolutely. In fact, it's a qualitatively different kind of juncture. It's not another vaccine, however important. It's the first time in human history that a child has been conceived in the laboratory outside the womb. And it raises, as I said, all kinds of issues about family life that we've been wrestling with, parenthood, childhood, sexuality. And what I focus on in this book is what it means for science and technology and where we want to draw the lines, where we have drawn lines in the past, where we want to draw lines in the future, about the kinds of research that we're willing to countenance with embryos in the laboratory.
Professor Banchoff, would you consider embryo politics to be a personal issue, a scientific issue, a state issue, a religious issue?
Well, I think it's all of those, and as a political scientist, I'm most interested in the political dimension. But what makes this book different from most political science books is the centrality of ethics and fundamental questions about life and death and human suffering that also link back to the personal level that you mentioned and link back to our great philosophical and religious traditions. For example, and again, we're familiar with this from the embryonic stem cell debate, how do you balance the moral status of the embryo, a human life at a very early stage, against the promise of regenerative medicine, research through embryonic stem cells that may help us cure or at least address diseases such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Both of those are moral imperatives. And it's fascinating to me to see how different societies with different histories seek to join those moral imperatives in practice, and how governments and political parties take them up and pass the laws that regulate this kind of activity.
If you would, walk us through or give us a snapshot of some of the European approaches to embryonic politics.
Well, they are different, and that's one of the fascinating things I think that I've learned. How different and unique our debates are here. It's what we tend to know. For example, the polarization between religious conservatives and secular scientists. You don't have that to nearly the same degree in Europe. So ironically, you'll have a country like Germany where religion plays much less of a role in the political sphere than it does in the United States. Or France is perhaps an even more important example. Countries where religion is less important in politics, and yet the politics and the regulations that emerge are more conservative, more restrictive than they are in this country.
How does that happen?
Well, it has to do with the very different historical legacies that shape debates on both sides of the Atlantic. In the US, and to some degree in the UK, it's abortion, which represents a frame of reference, and that emerged gradually, so that the issue of embryo research, the issue of stem cell research with embryos, gets grafted onto a very polarized abortion debate in this country. Therefore, religious conservatives against scientists. In Germany and France, the abortion issue was never settled, but a sort of compromise was reached early on in the 1970s, whereby abortion was recognized as a serious moral concern, the taking of an innocent human life, but legislators made the decision not to prosecute women or doctors. And that kind of pragmatic compromise took abortion off the table, so that the issue of embryo research, stem cell research, is framed by different legacies. And in Germany, the most important legacy is Nazism, eugenics, the experience with human experimentation during the Nazi era, something that resonates in France as well. And so there's generally more caution about science and technology and pushing some of the limits that Americans are more willing to push on the scientific side and more skeptical of on the religious side.
Professor Banchoff, do you agree that, or do you feel that abortion is relative to the embryonic politics debate?
I think it is. I mean, the issues that I raised up front about when life begins and deserves protection are issues that we recognize from the abortion debate. But the connection does not have to be as strong as it is in this country. And in fact, it's quite fascinating to see how the Catholic Church, in the first decade after this 1968 breakthrough, did not frame the issue of embryo research and IVF in terms of the abortion debate. Their concern was with the idea of using technologies of reproduction, taking sexuality outside the married couple and into the laboratory. That was the major concern. You can't really find much on the Catholic side until the 1980s condemning this as the taking of an innocent human life, this kind of research. And what happens is the abortion issue heats up, and the church finally comes out with a position in 1987 on IVF and on embryo research that is very restrictive and makes that connection, but it wasn't there at the beginning.
Are there pro-life movements in these European countries that you explore?
There are, most certainly. The UK is, as I mentioned before, the most similar to the US. There was a time in the mid-'80s when it looked like the pro-life movement there might be able to mobilize Parliament behind a total ban on embryo research, and that effort failed, and since then they've been on the defensive. They don't have the same societal base in the churches that the pro-life movement does here. The pro-life movement in Germany and France is much less significant.
Mm-hmm. Professor Banchoff, where have we gotten scientifically since 1978 when Louise Brown was born?
Well, a key juncture took place 5 years later when scientists were able to freeze or cryopreserve embryos. So since then we've dealt with the question of embryos left over from IVF treatments, and many of which will not be used by parents hoping to have children. And so that breakthrough of cryopreservation, the ability to thaw embryos and use them in research, created new opportunities for scientists to work with embryos and other research programs.